My guest today is an American philosopher whose work explores what games reveal about agency and the ways in which metrics can shape our desires. After graduating from Harvard, he enrolled in a PhD program at UCLA, completing his doctorate while simultaneously working as a food writer for the LA Times, an early sign of a career that would resist tidy categories. Now a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, he has become one of the leading thinkers at the intersection of games, art, and social structures. His first book, Games, Agency as Art, won the American Philosophical Association's 2021 Book Prize, arguing that games are a unique art form that shape who we are within their rules. His new book, The Score, examines how scoring systems from basketball to social media likes train us in what to value, and asks how we might stop playing someone else's game. An increasingly influential public thinker, he brings intellectual rigour and playful irreverence to some of the most urgent questions of our time. Welcome, Thi Nguyen.
Thank you. That was an excessively gratifying introduction. I feel all flushed.
Well, it's all true. And I'm very excited to get into it all with you. But first I'm going to do something terrible and try to sum up the thesis of your book, and then you can tell me where I'm wrong. Your book's brilliant. So clear and elegantly written, by the way. But this is sort of my takeaway. Metrics can be useful tools for game designers, but they often remove all joy from the experience of life and pastimes. Is that fair?
Roughly. Yeah. Yes.
How would you put it?
I would say that one of the interesting things about scoring systems is they make evaluation really clear, but they hit different in different contexts. I think it took me a while to realize, but so much of what makes the game experience so absorptive and so flexible is the game designer's ability to give us alternate desires through scores. And this for me is a gateway. I mean, not always, but often a gateway to joy and wonder and excitement and thrilling activity. And then in the rest of my life, I'm exposed to likes on Twitter, citation rates, student learning outcomes. And in that context, the scoring system seems to miss what's actually important. And I've been trying to figure out why. And there are a bunch of ways to say it, but the fastest and quickest way is that even though games have scoring systems, those scoring systems are typically under our local control. We can pick what they are. We can choose ones that please us. And then we can fine tune them, right? We can decide to speed run. We can hack the game system. We can do variations. We can house rule it. And we can do so following whatever weird interests we have. And I have some very weird gaming interests. And in the metrified world, we don't have that control. And they're typically contoured specifically to, in the cynical way of putting it, extract labor from us. But even more kindly, they're designed to be comprehensible at scale. And they haven't been tuned to the weird mysteries of the heart. Right? I can always explain to you why a metric is the way it is. I can tell you exactly what it's measuring and the social forces that minimize it and clarify it. And if you ask me why I love my favorite weirdo games that we're going to talk about, I'll be like, well, the scoring system does something. And it makes me feel kind of a way. But it's so hard to say what that way is and why it matters. And if no one else understands it, screw them. I'm going to play this game.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that comes through is that scoring, you say multiple times, you give so many different examples, just really flattens things. Metrics can flatten sort of, you give an example of speaking to some people who are working on an LLM that's trying to create art. This is pre-chat GPT, and you say, well, what's the sort of metric for success here that you're basing the work on? And they give the example of, well, we're basing it on the engagement numbers on Netflix that they use for their metrics. And you make the point that, well, that's certainly one way to look at what makes art. But I wonder, when numbers do flatten things so much, why are human beings so susceptible to them? Why do we love to chase them?
I mean, it's such a Such an interesting question. I mean, one answer people give you is, "Oh, they're objective. It's a more objective, true way of looking at the world." But I think in the interesting cases, the cases I'm really interested in are where there's a thing we really care about, and then there's this flat, simplified version of objectivity. Like we actually care about health and wellness, but that gets translated out to years uh, alive, right? Or we care about um, I, educators are supposed to care about like wisdom and curiosity, but it turns out that what the university largely measures is how quick students graduate and what their starting salary is, right? I think the I got an explanation from a scholar, Theodore Porter. He's a historian of quantification culture that I think explains both the flatness of metrics and their appeal at the same time in the same move. And I find this super fascinating. The way he puts it is that qualitative evaluations, like writing a video game review or writing a response to a student paper, they're rich, they're subtle, they're complicated, they're open-ended, but they travel badly between contexts because they require a lot of shared background information, right? My written response to my students is not going to be comprehensible to a business professor and vice versa. So he says what we do in institutions is we construct quantitative information. And quantitative information is a very specific kind of technology. We design it to cross contexts. We design it to be easily comprehensible across every layer of a bureaucracy. And we do it by stripping out high context, subtle information that requires a lot of shared background knowledge. So the distance between a rich qualitative explanation and a 10-point score or a letter grade, right? The difference between all the different values you could have in a tweet or in a podcast versus likes or subscriber counts, that narrowness is actually what makes it easily comprehensible, right? Like if we remove everything that requires subtlety to understand, then it's highly accessible. And so the answer comes in one. This is the terrifying thing for me, that the reason it's so appealing is that it's easy to explain yourself to other people, and it's easy to justify yourself to other people, and it's easy to be understood. And the reason that happens is because you've stripped out everything with nuance and context. So I think the attraction underneath is a kind of, and it's funny because games also have this attraction, but games have an attraction of a kind of temporary clarity, right? You know exactly what you care about during the game. But I mean, the thing about game scoring systems is they don't always travel well. If you like try to tell someone how thrilling it was that you got like extra fate points in your like last night RPG session, that is not comprehensible. That's one of the things that frees up games to be magical. Large scale metrics are tethered to things that are comprehensible to everyone, like starting salary or number of years lived. And that is the thing that I think both drives out richness and makes it so appealing. Because unlike with a lot of games, if you do well by a metric, that's a guaranteed comprehensible success rating to everyone.
It's so interesting you bring up reviews there, because throughout my career at different institutions I've worked for, there have always been tussles between the critics and the people who run the newspaper or the website, saying, oh, you need to condense your 1,500 word review into a 5-point rating or a score out of 10 or a score out of 100, whatever it might be, which is annoying. And usually the critics always fight against it. But like you say, it's very legible, isn't it? But I think one thing that I've noticed, and perhaps you've done this with, when you've worked as a professional critic as well, is that sometimes the score that you put at the bottom can act as a kind of like lens through which the reader then reads the prose, and it kind of warps it in some ways and, flattens the nuance, even though they're receiving the nuance. Is that something you've seen yourself?
Yeah. I mean, one way to put it is that metrics are summarization tools. That's what they're made for. They're made to strip out things that you need to consider along multiple dimensions and reduce things to one dimension. Like part of the background theory is the whole reason we want metrics is that without metrics, if we had a lot of rich qualitative information, you can't aggregate that easily. You can't aggregate 5,000 evaluations of a student, and you can't easily aggregate in any richness preserving way like 100 different reviews of a game. Like each of them pursues different dimensions. metrics are easily aggregatable, and I kind of think they create this fantasy of finality. Like part of what they're doing is they're saying like, look, we're summarizing and this is all there is to it. Like this is, the CEO's action summary, the bullet point summary. They're like an infrastructural version of the bullet point summary. And I think there's a way to interact with them. And we need them. Like we need them all the time. Like they are summarization tools. When we don't have time, we use them. I don't care about dishwashers, so I use ranking systems. And a lot of the times, if I've checked out, if I used to have all infinite time to pursue new music. Now I'm incredibly busy. And so often what I do is at the end of the year, if I have no other time, at least I'll go to like magazines I trust and I'll download like, what people thought were the top 30 of the year. Like they are summarization tools. They are attention getting tools. But one way of interacting with them is to use them as a starting point and to be like, well, if I don't have much time and a critic I love has written 100 things, I have no time, maybe a starting point is to look at their highly ranked numbers. But I think we're relatively safe if we use that as a starting point to opening up on the world. The flip side, and I had this, I think one of the starts of this book was like, there's a wine store, and there was a guy talking to the wine merchant, and you can probably see where this is going. He was like, well, I only buy wines that are 95 points and above. And the guy was like, well, that's just like, there are all kinds of things like you have to be interested in what you like, what you're in the mood for, what fits the meal. And the guy said, how am I supposed to know what I like? Just give me highly scored wines. And I think,
Yeah.
right, a scoring system that like prevents you from looking closely at the experience that's important, like one that like presents itself as final, that's the dangerous direction.
Right, yeah. And I suppose the other part of this, which you cover extensively in the book, is when those scoring systems are then, when they're turned back on us to affect our life in certain ways. And I'm thinking, particularly of lots of people who make video games listen to this show, and many of them will have experienced receiving or not receiving financial bonuses based on whether their game got above a certain Metacritic rating, for example. Yeah. And I know, you obviously work in education and have seen, your own department. I suppose you have different metrics that you're judged by to say whether you're better than a certain other place. Right. What's your view on that when they start to have very real effects, beyond just which bottle of wine or dishwasher do I buy?
Yeah. I think those are real effects too. But one of the vast worries I have is that a thing about metrics is they work well because they're standardized at scale, which means they're not going to be fine-tuned to variation. My university is a great example. I can whine about this forever, but it seems like, as far as we can tell, the primary metric that's being used to judge different departments and fund them is how many grants they get. Philosophers don't need grants. We don't have labs. We don't have research equipment, right? I just buy like $100 a books a year and I'm done. I'm good. But there's a kind of inflexibility to that measure from on high. And I think this does a bunch of things to us. I think one way to put it is that what metrics are good at is identifying qualities that are invariant across many contexts, right? Like, so it's really hard to find culinary joy or like community tradition or to track mental health via metric. It's really easy to track like number of years lived or heart attack rates. Those are the kinds of things that are easy to count. And so rule by metrics tends to orient us towards those very specific things that are easy to count and stable across contexts. But I think that really loses out on a lot of what's important in life, because a lot of what's important in life is not stable across contexts. And I think aesthetically, I think the aesthetic realm, like the realm of the arts, and let's be clear, games and video games, I think, are clearly in the realm of the arts. What makes something incredibly good is often dependent on a rich part of the experience of someone really understanding gaming culture. Watch a beginner like me try to rate good. I don't play barely like Street Fighter type fighting games, my ability to actually access what's good about a particular fight, it's just not there, right? It requires so much skill and so much immersion in a community. And so if you look at the kind of value that's kind of quickly accessible to everybody at scale, which is what a metric is going to pick up on, it's going to miss like the delicacy about what's important. So if you impose those as a primary ruler, right, then we're going to drift towards the kinds of values like engagement hours that connect everyone.
All right, T. Well, we've got so much more to dig into here, but we better turn to the premise of the podcast.
Right.
I've asked you to pick 5 video games that you'd like to put on your ideal fictional games machine, and like any good philosopher, you've approached this issue and tried to bend all of the rules in every way
cheated.
possible.
Let's be clear.
It.
I cheated. I definitely cheated. I know I cheated. I just couldn't resist.
I love it. Okay, well, tell us about your first game. We're going back to 2014 here. What's the game and why do you love it, T?
The game is Dream Quest. I mean, by the way, there's an alternate version of this where I dragged you through all of my early nostalgic favorites. I played all the old Infocom, like text adventure games. I played the old Ultima games. I love all those games. But I think if we're not just talking about nostalgia and growth, but about games right now that I would obsessively play still, Dream Quest shines so intensely. So Dream Quest, I think, is kind of the origin of a particular kind of game. It is the roguelike single-player deck builder. Dream Quest, I think, kind of set the skeleton on which Slay the Spire built. And for me, and this is I'm gonna sound like the ultimate hipster here. Like, I don't know. When I play Slay the Spire, people are gonna hate me so much. It feels to me like a more featureful, more bloated, more stuff to do, but not as beautifully like pure an experience as Dream Quest. So Dream Quest, the guy who made Dream Quest, I believe, there's a game journalist. So, God, I should have looked up his name. I forgot his name. He was hired afterwards to be part of the Hearthstone team. So like he's in this world, right? And Dream Quest was, as far as you know, it's the first roguelike deck builder that pioneers the style of you're going to navigate a dungeon, and every time you move through the dungeon and you level up or kill a monster, you get a choice of cards and you have to build cards on the fly. I played Dream Quest when it first, so let's be clear, Dream Quest has the worst graphics ever. I love them, but they are actual child stick figure drawings. I think, do you remember the name of the designer? I can't believe I forgot his name.
Peter Wallen, who's a previous guest of the show. Yeah.
So I played the game when it first came out. And again, I'm going to sound like the ultimate hipster, but there was only one difficulty mode, and it was so hard. Now there are multiple difficulty modes, and the original version, which is now, I think, the only difficulty mode is now, I think, if you buy the game now, it's the hardest difficulty mode. I mean, friends of mine who are good at like Magic the Gathering, they got through the beginning quickly. It took me like a week to survive the first dungeon. I just like died relentlessly. And I think the game is interesting because it's probably one of the most, in its original version, one of the most gruelingly hard games that I kept playing obsessively. And part of the beauty of the game, I think, is that it didn't let you build an optimum deck, and you had to design for flexibility. And I find this an incredibly interesting design strategy. So it reminds me a little bit of Go. Like I played in an alternate universe. I would only have one game in my life, Go. And part of what you learn about Go is if you get too obsessed with a particular linear path, even more than chess, if you get too obsessed with one path, you lose. In many cases, what you need to play for is you need to play for flexibility. You need to make moves where you have a wide open option space. You don't box yourself in, and you're often trading off in this really complicated way between decisions that will advance you in a really clear on the board way and decisions that have this kind of ineffable quality of like flexibility and fluidity that let you respond in multiple ways. And you're often making moves specifically because, so there's this idea in Go called like good shape. And when part of what it is to have good shape is that the relationship of the pieces doesn't lock you in. It can move energetically in a lot of directions. An interesting thing about Dream Quest that I think a lot of future games didn't have was that you could sort of scout the dungeon and sort of see what the challenges would be before you started building. Like a good player, like got as much information as they could about the space before they started making card decisions about what to go in their deck. But other games in this space give you enough choice that you can plausibly make an optimum deck according to your strategy. This wouldn't let you do that, right? The card draw was too random, and you often had to build decks that could be flexible depending on what new opponents you would see and what new cards would come in. And I find that quality I find is a really rare quality. There are more and more games, both in the kind of computer game strategic space and in the board gaming space I love, where you can start out immediately and you can see an optimum strategy, and the optimum strategy is kind of within the range of calculation, and you don't have to worry about kind of large-scale meta flexibility management. And I love that this game, as part of its difficulty, forced you to constantly trade off between how flexible you are and the actual on-the-ground power of your deck. And that's like a deep decision. And I think one of the most interesting things in games for me is when they promote the kind of deep decision that's beyond pure arithmetic calculus, where you're often trading off between different levels. Okay, let me tell you a story about what an asshole I am. Let's see. I had a guy. I used to play. He was when we were in philosophy grad school. He knows who he is. And we played chess. And this guy refused to play with a chess clock because he thought it stressed him out too much. And he would take super long on every move. And he would just try to brute force calculate out every possibility. And then I started to realize when I played against him that there was a kind of complicated way I could play where instead of making moves that were purely strategically good, I could play to exhaust his mind. I could just keep playing to open up the strategic space and make the complications more calculated and just chill out and not worry about it until his brain fried, and then he would start making mistakes. He was deeply offended by this. I think it's super interesting, by the way, that like in games like soccer, playing to exhaust your opponent is just, in boxing, that's part of the strategy space.
Sure.
And people often don't think of it. I think poker people sometimes do this, but people don't often think of it in the gaming space. But I love things where you have to make trade-offs between multiple levels of resources at different levels of abstraction, right? Like playing to exhaust people or playing to freak people out, right? Or playing to open up the strategic space or playing to be flexible. And you have to trade. And those trade-offs, and I think this is actually interestingly against the background of metrics, the most horrible kind of life is one where all your value calculations are arithmetically calculable and there's not deep decisions. And the games that are super interesting often, I think they ask me a question about who I am, and there's not a clear answer to that. And sometimes the answer is like, are you more risk tolerant or not? Do you want to play a chaotic surfing game or do you want to lock things down? And getting to figure out on the fly in the detail the person you are, it's something I love so much.
Do you find, like, we've talked about this before on the show with some people when, for example, they play a game like, I don't know if you're aware of, like Final Fantasy Tactics or one of those like chess-like games that they play, they played in like 1998 and then they went back and played it again 20 years later and found that they just made all the same decisions in that way that you're talking about now. It's almost innate that there is something about their personalities and the way their mind works that locks us into particular patterns, even when we're in a playful space, right? Have you found that with yourself?
I mean, I think it's really important. There are two reasons why you might play in the same way. One is that the game space is so narrow that there's an optimum strategy for it. And the other is that the game space is rich enough that it allows you to express yourself, but you're a particular kind of person, so you're going to express yourself in the same way. Like there's a particular, I think one thing that people, I'm going to say something and I'm going to take it back. So there's one way I think that there's a particular kind of, and I see this the most often in modern board games, but I also see it in some kind of modern systems type RPG games, in which you can calculate an optimum path. And a lot of people like to play it by finding that optimum path and sticking to that optimum path. And it doesn't ask you any existential questions about who you are. And there's no room in optimum play for like style. I think a different kind of game exposes who you are. When I play chess or Go against someone, when I play like CCG games like Magic the Gathering, my favorite CCG is the game that Richard Garfield made after Magic, Netrunner, which is also a game that, like asks these incredibly cool questions about risk tolerance. You can feel the kind of person the other person is. Like, I have this weird sense that, some of the most intimate I've ever been with another person is strangers at a Go table or a chess table, because you're so deep in people's mind. And you can, if the game is fully mechanical, all you're deep in is like who's executing the math better. But when you're in a game that offers you rich choice, you can tell how much flair and creativity and how much and you can tell how people play. Like I think my way of playing is best characterized by, at least in board games, I've been told, liking to deceive people with moves on the board. Not with my face, but not with my face or my words, but like doing like deceptive, like incentive play or deceptive, like lying with your moves, or like sometimes there's a thing in like fencing and tennis where you can like lull someone into a rhythm and then go off rhythm. Like if you can do that in a board game, like I hear people can do this in 2D fighting games. I'm not good enough to do that, but like that possibility of that kind of interplay and having that kind of personality. One of my favorite game playing companions, Andrew, it's super funny. He does best when the board game space is tight and controllable, and I do best when it's chaotic and I can like just make everyone kind of confused. And you can see both of us like trying to modulate. He's always trying to lock down the decision space, and I'm always trying to like explode things with chaos, and we can feel each other. And I love that. And Dream Quest is the kind of game that even as a single player, I feel like when I made a deck, I can feel the weird, particular personal choices I made in that game. I want to put one proviso on it, which is I just don't think all great games have this capacity. One of the things, there's this interesting study, I'm a rock climber too, and really good rock climbers at the World Cup, they climb problems almost exactly the same. There is an optimum solution, and there's some truly great puzzle games where definitionally puzzle games have one solution, I think. And so this doesn't apply to everything, but there are so many games where I feel like if your weird flair can come through, then the game is really pulling, it's really pulling something special out of you. It's made a space. Okay, let me say one weird thing, and then I've been ranting too long, but my first book, Games Agency as Art, is about how I was really pushing back against this idea that video games are great when they're like movies and they have good cinematics. And I was really like worried about, how point structures and constraints can shape freedom and creativity. And one of my first thoughts was like, games are actually in some ways less like movies and more like governments. They're like toy governments for fun. They're like rules that are interesting. And one of the things you might think about a government is that a good government leaves space for us to be free. And I think a lot, not all, but a lot of good games leave space for us to have style, have creativity, have personal flair, make rich value choices. And when you get to do that in a hard, mechanically dense game like Dream Quest, what's better?
Brilliant. Wow. That was so good. Right, we're going to be here for 3 hours at this rate, so I'm going to have to move us along. Okay, let's come to your story then, T. So, where did you grow up, and what kind of kid were you?
San Jose, California. My parents were Vietnamese immigrants fleeing the war. Um, they, I was born here. My dad
Well, when
was.
did they get here?
They got here in '75. My dad was. It's funny. One way to tell my story is, I grew up poor, an immigrant's child, and I fought my way to a PhD. And the other way to tell my story was, my dad was a math professor at University of Saigon. Then he immigrated, landed in San Jose in 1975. Math professor in San Jose in 1975 has some opportunities. Ended up on the Intel
Oh, he
engineering
did, right?
staff.
Nice.
Yeah, and my first computer was like an obsolete Intel mainframe that he brought home. That was like,
Cool.
and my
How
first
big?
games, about the size of a refrigerator, blue. Floppy disks were 1.5 feet. I played Colossal Caves, the first text game, in a
Yep.
fridge size. Right. I've been gaming for a while. I grew up in San Jose. I was a weirdo. Most of my family turned out to be computer programmers in San Jose, and I was the one weirdo that went to philosophy. And I played games my whole life too. I played tabletop role playing. I played so many video games. I played so many board games. And during graduate school, I was studying kind of more conventional philosophy topics, and I was also playing a ton of video. At that time, it was actually more board games. I played more video games through my teenage years, and around grad school was when this kind of European board game explosion was beginning to hit the US, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, these are such cool, beautiful, elegant games. And I was just playing tons of them and then posting them about them on Board Game Geek. And then I ended up having a weird career turn because philosophy of games is not supposed to be a real part of philosophy. And all my mentors were like, what are you doing with your career? And I was just like so fascinated by what games revealed about us and the structure of human value, and why we played games. And I just got sucked into this like decade-long odyssey of trying to figure out a philosophical theory of the value of games.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you about that exact thing. What other philosophers could have, how they taken your interests and your speciality. So, that sort of, well, not pivot, but when you started to become interested in looking at games through the lens of philosophy, was that when you were an undergraduate at Harvard, or does that come later?
No, that was UCLA. That was graduate school. It was towards the end of my time there. I was teaching philosophy of art courses, and I was doing studies in video games and reading a lot of this stuff where people were defending games as a kind of movie and getting kind of angry. I mean, it's a very familiar thing from the history of art. Every time you get a new art form, people try to make it like an old art form, right? That people try to force photography to be like oil painting. People try to force, right, comics to be like, when they get arty, they try to make them like novels and like sometimes kill the thing that's good about them. So I was writing about this stuff, and I think there's a little bit of work in the philosophy of games, and I found this one thing, the most beautiful kind of like now a cult text, but it was lost for a while and ignored. Bernard Suits' book, The Grasshopper. It's a book about the philosophy of games, and he has this definition of what a game is, where he says, to play a game is to voluntarily take on unnecessary obstacles to create the process of struggling to overcome them. One way to put it is that in games, there's an easy way to get to the end, but we avoid that. I mean, I think that's easiest in physical games, like a marathon, right? You could take a taxi, but you don't because what you care about is doing it in a particular way. With video games, I think you could hack it. You could skip to the end. You could look up a walkthrough for a puzzle game online, but we don't, right? Because we want the process of doing it for ourselves. It's not on my list, but my favorite puzzle game these days is Baba Is You. Is beautiful. And think about the loss to a human being if they buy it and then they look up all the answers online and never try to do it themselves, right? Games are avoiding the efficient path through, which might be a walkthrough, in order to have the experience of doing it yourself. And I think what Suits makes clear is that to understand the value of games, you have to come to understand that doing things is valuable in and of itself, not just outcomes. So Bernard Seuss was an Aristotle scholar, and what Aristotle said was meaning in life comes from the rich exercise of our capacities, not outcomes or end products. And I think what Seuss thought was that games rub our face in that like existential reality, that what matters is process.
Yeah, you describe it as the striving games, don't you? I think
Right.
at one point, that's your term, yeah.
Yeah, so the key distinction for me, the thing that I sort of added to Suits is that I think one way to think about it is there are two kinds of play, achievement play and striving play. Achievement play is playing because you care about winning. You care about actually succeeding via this process. And striving play is where you don't really care about winning, but you get yourself kind of sucked into the desire to win, to have the struggle. And I think that's what a lot of us are interested in. Not all. I think a lot of Olympic athletes are probably achievement players. A lot of video game players are achievement players. But I am interested in the delight of the struggle and not in being a winner.
All right, T, we better come to your second game. So this is a true video game from 2016. Tell us about this one. What's the game? Why do you know about it?
Hyperlight Drifter. Hyperlight Drifter is so good. It's so good. I mean, I'm not alone in loving Hyperlight Drifter. Hyperlight Drifter is personally interesting to me because I'm so bad at it. I should just say I have not finished Hyperlight Drifter. I am a person born and raised on turn-based strategic computer games. What I'm good at is like XCOM or like Civ or like that's what I grew up on. I am so bad at arcade games and video games that I used to date someone that when she was depressed, she made me play Super Mario Brothers just to laugh at me failing to get past the first level. I'm just awful. So let me just be clear. Hyperlight Drifter, I think, actually it's good that it comes here because Hyperlight Drifter truly shows that I'm a striving player. Because if you're an achievement player, you should play games you're good at, right? I should play chess and Go and Dream Quest and Slay the Spire, games that I'm badass at. I should not play Hyperlight Drifter because I'm so bad at it. But I think the thing that Hyperlight Drifter does, there's a thing, I mean, it's so obvious. But there are games that happen at the speed of thought or below, where you can think your way through things. And there are games that happen faster than thought. And if you try to think consciously, you're going to lose. And a game that pushes you, so you have to abandon yourself to reflexes, but complex reflexes, trained reflexes. So I'm thinking about the way that the thing I love about Hyperlight Drifter is the way it trains you to be able to cope with its mobs, right? Like it gives you one, it gives you a couple, it gives you start to be able to learn their movement patterns. You can kind of get it. And it kind of, I love the degree to which the movement patterns are subtly synced to the music. So if you're like, I don't know about you, but I find that that's a game where if I'm kind of grooving out to the music with my body, I do better. I'm more in sync with it. And then you get like the flurry of mobs. People who are good at games will not find the Hyperlight Drifter difficult. For me, the emotional experience of having to give up on rational control and let my character dance in complicated ways, not pure reflex, but finding shifting patterns in the movement of the enemies and like kind of dance between them. That's incredible. That's like feeling your skills. And I mean, it's funky because it's you're doing it, you're making choices, but those choices are happening faster than thought. And like getting yourself into that space is so wonderful. And there's like, it's such, I think some of my favorite absorptive experiences in games, Hyperlight Drifter is one of my favorites. And the other favorite of mine, it's totally different, is fly fishing. So fly fishing is this incredible, for me, a sport, a game. And part of what's good about fly fishing is when you fly fish, you have to pay attention to so many variables at once, more than your mind could comprehend. You're trying to keep track of every piece of information about the water flows, how the water is flowing, to feel out where the trout might be hiding. You're trying to look for little signs of moving trout. You're trying to monitor the birds and the insects and the ambient temperature to feel when the insect life might be moving. And there's too much information. So your consciousness just has to kind of surf the information. And there's like Hyperlight Drifter makes you do that fast, and fly fishing makes you do it slow. But in both cases, there's an information overload that's beyond your rational brain, and you just got to float it. I mean, I don't know if that's your experience of a game like Hyperlight Drifter. Maybe you don't have that experience if you're actually good at games like that, but that's my experience.
No, definitely. Yeah, no, and that's sort of one of the big appeals, in addition to all the things that you pulled out with Dreamcast, I suppose flow state games are, that's what a lot of us are chasing, is that moment, isn't it? So.
Yeah, but I think there are different kinds of flow state. There are like thinner flow states where you're responding to a really narrow amount of information. And then there are the kinds of flow states where you're dealing with complex decisions and informational overload. And that, for me, is where it turns juicy.
Amazing. Wow, I think you inspired some people to go and take up fly fishing from this for now.
It's so good.
Okay, well, let's come back to your story then, Thi. So, yeah, you tell us about being a food writer for the LA Times. How did that come about?
Oh my God. You want the actual story? The actual story is ridiculous. So I was in graduate school in Los Angeles, and I was posting to this old school food forum called Chowhound, where people, talked about where the good food was, way before Yelp, like kind of free-form forum. And the origin story is that somebody was wrong on the internet. So,
as ever.
Yeah, as ever. There's a place I love in Los Angeles called Roscoe's House of Chicken and Waffles. It serves Southern-style fried chicken and waffles. And it's wonderful, like fried chicken, gravy, butter, maple syrup, soft, tender waffles. You wrap it all up. And someone was complaining that they were technically supposed to be Belgian waffles, but Belgian waffles were supposed to be crispy, and these were soft, and so they were bad. And I was like, you're so wrong. The softness is integral. And I was like, I need to do some field research. So the original Roscoe's was 5 blocks from my house and open till 4 a.m. So I had like 3 shots of whiskey, and I walked down and I ate this stuff. It was so good. And I was like, it's like crispy fried chicken and sweet maple syrup and rich gravy and then soft waffle. And I'm like, this reminds me of something else. And I was like, oh, it's Peking duck. It's like the same pattern, right? Like fluffy steamed bun, sweet hoisin or plum sauce, crispy duck skin.
Oh, you're making my mouth also.
But I posted this thing about Joseph Campbell and the eternal forms of food and how different cultures would converge on the same patterns. And I went to sleep. And apparently the LA Times food editor had been watching my posts and was like, apparently he thought he had to hire me because of that. So that's how I started writing about food.
That's amazing. What was your first commission then?
It was either an op-ed in which LA was trying to make food trucks illegal because they were an illegitimate form of food, and I was so angry. Or it was, oh God, I can't even remember. Like I just became a weekly, semi-weekly like finder of cool ethnic foods, and there was just, I don't know, did I write like 50 or 60 columns? I can't remember, but I remember one of the early ones was probably a really good Hong Kong fried sticky tofu joint. It was just like trying to describe how good that stuff was is really... I actually ended up using those skills again when I was like writing. I'd never done game reviews, but when I was writing these books, I had to describe games well. And it was coming out, I was like, oh, I like this description. I was like, oh, it's just my old food review skills waking up again. It's like
nice.
Visceral description of delight. It's the same skill.
And did writing about food changed the way that you thought about philosophy at all, or vice versa?
At first, no. It's a great question. Over time, yeah. Writing about food in the beginning was just something totally separate in my life. And over time, I think the way it influenced philosophy was in the game stuff. Because writing about food is about being loyal to the rich weirdness. And philosophy often asks you to ignore what's richly weird and just go by the abstract theory. And one of the reasons I love philosophy of art is it doesn't let you do that. You got to be abstract, but you also got to be loyal to the weirdness of the beauty that you love. And I think a lot of what I loved about the reason I wanted to write about games was out of loyalty to this, like the thick interestingness of decisions and movements that didn't show up anywhere else in the philosophy, or it kind of is ignored by the kind of high culture. And I was just like, but this weirdness, this energy is the thing I care about.
I love that. Beautifully put. Right, we're going to come to your third game. So this is an interesting one. I'm going to let you deal with this. Tell us, what's the game and why did you love it?
It's a complete cheat. The game is Apocalypse World, an indie tabletop role-playing game, and I'm cheating by putting it on my electronic console by talking about how we discovered during the pandemic how good tabletop role-playing games were on Zoom. I mean, I really liked this game ahead of time, and we can talk a lot about it, but one of the things I really discovered was, so, we were lonely during the pandemic. Things were brutal. And one of the things, you'd try to do hangouts with friends, and it would be okay, but Zoom's really awkward, and like an unstructured hangout, it feels weird on Zoom, right? It's very unnatural. But tabletop role-playing is just enough structure that it's really, really natural, especially like with the weird time delays and stuff, having a GM there being like, okay, what do you do? What do you do? Like that. And that's, I mean, and of course it's tabletop role-playing. You're goofing off with your friends, you're making up stories, you're telling jokes. But I think before we found role-playing, we would try to once in a while hang out with our friends, and it would be like 20 minutes of awkwardness, and then we'd kind of drift off or whatever. Or you try to do dumb shit like watch a movie with, like Zoom on, and it's okay. And then tabletop role playing, like we had like 2 sessions a week with 2 different groups that went like 2 or 3 hours, and it was just delight. I think it like saved my sanity in a really deep way. But I want to talk about a specific game. There's a whole world of indie tabletop role playing, and this is the point where I've become aware of. I say a lot of, like, in the work I've done, aggro things about bureaucracy and institutions and metrics, and almost nobody pushes back on that. And the one thing that people push back the most on is me saying I don't like D&D very much. This is the rage inspirer. So I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. I played Dungeons and Dragons through my entire youth. And Dungeons & Dragons is great for certain kinds of stories and certain kind of players, but there's this really interesting indie movement that starts from people being a bit discontented by the way that Dungeons & Dragons builds narrative. So there's a lot of mechanics, and one way to put it that a lot of people in the space said was that Dungeons & Dragons has a lot of mechanics for killing, looting, and shopping, and then not many mechanics in its original form. It's evolved now in its original form for other stuff, especially in character narration. And you can do that. You can definitely do that. But when you do that well, you're actually getting a fair amount of distance from the mechanics, and the mechanics rarely offer a lot of support. So a lot of what the indie movement did was try to find mechanical support for people that wanted a different kind of very narrative, very character-based role-playing. And the systems are just so fascinating. And one of the things they start doing. So the game I picked is Apocalypse World. I think this is the height, but let me walk up to it, because I just want to talk about rules, because some of the rules are so interesting in this space. So one of my favorite rules is in Lady Blackbird. It's a cheap PDF. It's like a game. The rules are like one page. It's from John Harper. And as this rule, you have this pool, this dice pool. You start with 7 and you can add them to your rolls. They make you like super powerful, right? Like you can do all kinds of crazy stuff by adding dice pool rolls, dice from your dice pool. And then they run out. And then the game says, to refresh your dice pool, you need a refreshment scene where you and another player character discuss your shared backstory. And so what that does is it forces you to invent shared backstory. So the rhythm is, right, you exhaust yourself, all this stuff happens. It's a very cinematic rhythm, right? And then you have to find a quiet moment. And then you have to make up shared backstory. This game was really intended for like 1 or 2 sessions. And the way it works is by the end of it, if you've had a high adventure, you keep having to find quiet moments and doing this thing. And then the game incentivizes you to fill out your characters' backstories. It also has the most amazing rule, which is in a pinch, you can do this in a flashback. So if someone's like falling off a building and everyone's out of dice pools, you can lock eyes and have your flashback. It's amazing. Another rule in the space that I found lovely is, so the fate system has this. So one of the things people notice about D&D is that, I mean, D&D has now changed a lot and absorbed a lot of these rule ideas, but the early D&D I started in I think I started in, second edition I played a lot, but I was playing like the really early rule sets. The red box was my first box. It doesn't reward playing in character. So if your character is dumb, you don't roll well, but nothing incentivizes you to play dumb, right, in the game. And you often have this tension where either you play in character or you play to the incentives, and you have some resistance to your character. So a lot of people are trying to come up with ways to incentivize playing in character. So Fate has this system where you have these character aspects that are written descriptions that are supposed to be 2-edged swords. Like you're super stubborn, or you love fire, or you're a drunken lout, or something like this. And the game says there's a secondary economy of things called fate points. They're not experience points. You get fate points for acting in character according to your aspects and getting yourself and your team into trouble. And then you redeem the fate points to activate those same aspects to give you bonuses in rolls.
Very
cool. So you can kind of see how this plays out, right? It's so narrative. It incentivizes you to get yourself trouble by being stubbornly in character. And the more you play in character, the more your characterness redeems you later on. And again, it incentivizes players to look for trouble and generate trouble out of their characters, and then rewards it. So you don't have to fight against the system to do it. It's like, if that's your impulse, the system is in tune with that. So that's Fate. Okay. I'll get the actual game now. So Apocalypse World is my favorite game in the space. It's from Vincent McGay Baker. They're incredible game designers. And Apocalypse World has this system that actually flips the reality of the world in this fascinating way. So different characters have they're called playbooks. So whatever character class you have, you pick a playbook. And the playbooks give you substantially different abilities. And a lot of those abilities are connected to question lists. So there are standard question lists that everyone has, and then weird other abilities that give you access to different question lists. And so the way that Dungeons & Dragons works, the way that most of us play it, is the metaphysics are the dungeon master makes up the world, and they make up like a secret door. And a player, if they're walking by and they're like, is there a secret door? The player has to roll a perception check. And if the dungeon master already put a door there and the player rolled well, then they get to find out about the door. But if the dungeon master didn't do it ahead of time, there's no door. In Apocalypse World, if a character rolls and say their perception ability, and they choose from a question list the question, what's my best way out of here? The game master has to make one up. But there are other questions. Another question is, what is my opponent's biggest vulnerability? And if they roll well, the game master has to make up a vulnerability. And then different characters have vastly different lists. So one of my favorite characters, the brainer is supposed to be this weird, creepy, psychic fucker. And he has a question list where if he rolls well and he like gets his hands on you, he can select from a set of questions. And the questions include, what is your lowest moment in your life and how do you try to forget about it? And for what do you crave forgiveness and from whom? Right. And just think about how this, I remember one time I was setting up a fight with this like mob boss and I thought my character was going to like attack or escape. And then instead one of them does this thing and asks the question like, for whom do you crave forgiveness? And I'm the game master. I had to be like, okay. The mob boss accidentally got his daughter hooked on his own product. And now his daughter is like lost as like a drug addict and he desperately wants to, and then, like, instead, the players took the narrative in the direction of, like, finding family redemption and healing for this mob. So, like, another way to put it is this forces, wherever the players want to look, we are forced to fill in the world around their interests. And different characters get to ask incredibly different questions. In one of the new games, the most amazing game, maybe, I've just started playing it from the same team, Vincent McGay Baker. Under the Hollow Hills, you play the fairies in a fairy circus who go from town to town, finding people's troubles and solving them with your circus fairy show. And you have abilities like share a vulnerability to force another person to share their vulnerabilities. It just drives astonishing narrative. It just gets players to be so interestingly creative so quickly. And I just love these systems. Sorry, I ranted way too long.
Good. No, brilliant. I'm wondering, in these situations, do you prefer being the game master or do you prefer being a player?
I love both so much. And one of the games in this space, Night Witches, which is based on the true story of the only Soviet women's Air Force battalion, where tons of people died, that game had this rule idea. People are dying they're like falling in love with each other and having romances and running missions and dying all the time. And the rule is when someone dies, they immediately rotate out and become the new game master instantly. And the previous game master instantly rotates in as the new recruit. And this kind of dispersed, especially since it's built with rule sets where you're just kind of making up the world along. We also pair it with, so there's some really interesting games. There's two tabletop games I love called Microscope and Quiet Year. Microscope is a game where you collaboratively build the history of a world together, and Quiet Year is a game where you collaboratively build a city together and its history and its landmarks. And if you start a campaign by co-building it, and then you trade off GM duties, then you don't get this static narrative. You get this and you use one of these systems that's so built for collaborative storytelling, you just get this wild, unexpected, unpredictable creativity, and you get these stories that really feel like everybody's. And I think that's one of the truly remarkable achievements of modern gaming, the ability to build systems that make it easy for people to suddenly just start creatively and together genuinely building novel stories. And I love this stuff so much.
Very interesting. My kind of earlier where you were talking about what a sort of how you're drawn to chaos when you're playing games. You like to where an opponent might be trying to reduce the possibility space. You like to throw it wide open. If there are too many of those kind of characters, if one of those games you're describing, I guess, it can be quite a ride, I imagine.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is, so you can't actually have too big a player count for some of these games, but also some of them, they make it more manageable by really channelizing the kind of actions. So a lot of these games, like if it's a noir game, all the characters have very noir-y moves and they're really narrow. In this fairy circus game, one of the interesting things is there's almost no combat moves at all, right? Most of the moves are one of the characters has the move of, if you're Cordius, everyone has to stop fighting and listen and talk until you dismiss. And the fact that the game space is sort of narrowed in the way makes creativity easier and more manageable because the game interestingly directs people into a similar space. This might be a good pause. I've just noticed that my computer plug is not plugged in and my computer is about to be out of battery. So I got to...
Oh, cool. Yeah. Do you want to go do that?
Something once Okay, good. The computer will not suddenly mysteriously crash in the middle.
Good, no worries. Are you all right for kind of 15 minutes more?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, great. Awesome.
All right, great. Cool.
It's my fault. It's so, I mean, I've been doing a lot of podcasts lately where like serious people are kind of like, oh, you write about games. And then like I have to, make it look adult. And it's a particular joy to not have to worry about that and to really like indulge in a love of games.
Yeah, you don't have to do that around here. We already think they're the most serious things. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder how that has changed. I mean, look, I have written about games a lot for mainstream outlets over the years and have noticed how people's perception of games or understanding or familiarity with them has changed like over time, and where, certainly in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were very looked down on in the way that, comic books would have been or pop music at a certain time. And these days, it's not quite so like that. How's it feel in academia?
I mean, I think it's just, a lot of this is just generational. Like,
Yeah.
I'm 48 and I'm of the first gen that I grew up with an Atari and a Super Nintendo. And I think right above me, people did not. And I think there was a kind of, people played sports, but I think, even though I think they're both a game, people don't make the same cultural association. And I think basically as my generation and below moves up through cultural positions of power, right? Like, I came up with a book about games and, it was reviewed by, I was like, the reviewer in The Guardian is a gamer and is a serious journalist. And I think that wouldn't have happened like 10 years ago. Like people who had the kind of social power to review books in outlets like that would not ever have grown up on games and have loved games. And I think there's just, I mean, one of the great philosophers of science, Thomas Kuhn, talks about how when you have massive paradigm shifts, the old generation typically has trouble making the intellectual shift over to grasp the new paradigm. And then he says, like, so how does it change? People get older and the older generation just ages out and retires. And I think it's there's some people that make the jump, but I think it's an age cohort thing, and I can feel it. It's right where I am, like one generation older than me, and it's kind of like, yeah, sure. And then the generation younger, it's like, oh yeah, of course I grew up playing, Mario 64. It's like a delight. And I think you are also saying a thing, at least for me, where I don't know if this has happened to you, but, I'm married now. I have kids. And I don't really play a lot of single player video games that take 100 hours because I just don't have 100 hours. And what I do have after work, after putting the kids to bed, at most, my wife and I have like 30 or 40 minutes. And if we just went and played separate video games separately, that would be kind of sad. And I think a lot of my generation in this situation, this is part of the reason for the resurgence of board games. Like a lot of the gaming impulse that we have and love can now be channeled to a social setting. And I've also noticed that, so my wife and I were both like, as kids, addicted to Civilization. And one of the things is that a lot of the games that are being made for about my age bracket, like my favorite of these is Tom Lehman's Res Arcana, which is his follow-up to Race for the Galaxy, which is a really well-known game. They feel like the best part of Civilization played against somebody in like 20 or 30 minutes. And so I feel like we can like divert that impulse over to something that scratches the gaming urge, but is also essentially social and time spent with, my spouse that is fun and is also gaming.
Yeah, so good. By the way, have you played Civilization Revolution? It's a few years old now, but
I am off Civilization. I'm never allowed to touch it again.
Oh, okay. Well, I bring it up
clean.
because it's one of those where you can play it in half an hour. It's sort of yes.
I still don't.
The way you said that was like an addict who is just caught a waste of like.
There was a moment in which I threw away my CD-ROM of Civilization, I think 3, and then I literally was at 2 a.m. digging through a garbage can to pull it out, and I'm like, I can't. So I think that's the kind of thing I'm most vulnerable to, and so I'm genuinely not allowed to play video games like that. And one of the neat things about the board games is that they're self-limiting. Right, I can't play them unlimitedly. I also just think that we can talk. This is a weird angle. I think there's a lot of reason why computer games are so increasingly fine-targeted engineered for this kind of addictive time loss sensation. And that's not a desideratum in board gaming. I just don't feel that compulsion. And I'm happier that way. Like I play as much of the game as I find interesting and rich. It's also true of a lot of games that I like, a lot of my favorite video games now, like Baba Is You, I'm not compelled to play it hugely. It's like a really interesting set of puzzles, and I'm tired, I put it away. And I think that's a friendly relationship that I find easier to cultivate with things like tabletop role-playing and board gaming these days.
Very interesting. Yeah, we could definitely talk lots about that, but we better come to your fourth game. I'm conscious of the time. So
Okay.
this is from 2020, and it's another board game, but with an iOS version. So yeah, tell us what's the game.
I'm cheating again. I'm sorry. I just can't. I have to cheat. So the game is Root. I put it on my Perfect console because there is an iOS version that is a very good implementation. But I know it mostly as a board game. And I think of this there's been such an incredible revolution in board game design in my lifetime. And Root is kind of the contemporary classic. So the great board game designers of the first German Revolution in the 80s and 90s were Wolfgang Kramer and Rainer Knizia. They're incredible. And one of the things I think that they were really good at is, so there's this interesting history of German board gaming. So first, I don't know if it's still true, but when I last looked into it, the average German family played more board games together than watched TV, which is wild, right? I think that number was pre-YouTube revolution, so I don't know what holds now. But there's also apparently, after World War II, a lot of German board gaming moved away from chess and war games and became a lot of German board gamers seized on a set of designs by an American designer named Sid Saxon. And Sid Saxon in the 60s and 70s really innovated these kind of market-based games and auction-based games. And so German board gaming and European board gaming started exploring market mechanics, auction mechanics, interactive markets. And it's super interesting because for me, when I was playing board games as a kid, the more complicated American board games had these massive downtime structures and had a typically very war gamey chess presumption. And auction games, I think, are typically just a better way for 5 people to play against each other. Rather than everyone taking their turn moving all their pieces, when you have an auction, everyone's in all the time. You're doing these auctions, and then the way the market fluctuates and the way you interact, you're interacting with everyone simultaneously. And you can do this really interesting incentive play, very much like, I think a lot of these games are also influenced by No Limit Poker. And so, especially out of Kramer and Knizia, you got these incredibly refined ways of interacting with each other via complicated auctions or complicated incentive mechanics in between. One of my most favorite of these early games is a game from Wolfgang Kramer called El Grande, where what was super interesting was, it was maybe the most interesting auction I know in a game. It is a game in which every turn there's like standard board play, and every turn there are 5 incredibly different actions that are available in the market. And they're like, some of them are weak, some of them are strong, and they do hugely different things. They let you move pieces in totally different ways. And then you have to bid money for your order of choosing which your action is. And you have 1 pot of money for the whole game. And that decision, bidding for turn order in choosing against other people for substantially different movement opportunities against a board state you can all see, is such a rich, interesting decision. And Root is the far end of this. Root is Cole Worley, designer of Root, is a goddamn genius. And he's taken this, he is like the next, if the previous generation were like Mozart and Beethoven, he's the Stravinsky. He's like the innovator. And Root is a game that takes all this stuff to the next level by creating completely different sides that follow completely different rules and have completely different incentive structures. And you're interlocking between different sides that do totally, work, each different side has a completely different mechanical way of working. One of the sides, the bourgeois industrial, by the way, it has this cute woodland animal theming, but it's about politics and death and economic manipulation. One of the sides is the Marquise de Cat, who is the fat cat industrialist, who plays a classic economic board game of building infrastructure and improving technology to make more money to build more infrastructure. Another side, the Woodland Alliance, plays the communist revolutionaries, who are little squirrels underground, right? And they're very weak at first, and every time some side kills one of them, they get points for the sympathy of the people. And they use the sympathy of the people to blow up and revolutionize certain towns. And their goal is to disrupt the infrastructure network and convert people over. And then another side is the old military who don't have an economic infrastructure and have to make campaign promises. And every turn they can execute all the campaign promises they've ever made. So they get more and more moves, but they're trapped in their old campaign promises. And another side are arms dealers who want to make money by selling arms to all the other side. And another side are a quiet religion that can't attack and it can only grow slowly and has no capacity to attack unless someone kills them, in which case they get 2 suicide bomber pieces. So, this game is an attempt to model the incredible complexity of political life by giving different sides each side has a completely different action set and a completely different incentive structure. And when you play the game, the true way to play the game is to switch sides between every round. And then you suddenly see deep, interscene, generational political conflict from the side of the industrialist, from the side of the revolutionaries, from the side of the arms dealer, right? And it's wild. Like, it's the most interesting gaming experience.
And there's an iOS version, you said?
Yep, there's an iOS version, plays great, plays against other people.
Very cool. Okay, well, we'll check that out. That's Root. Okay, well, we'll come to your 5th game in a minute. Yeah. But I mean, while you were talking about some of that, I was thinking about, just to go back a little bit to the sort of origins of your story, I was thinking your family came to the US from a country at which the United States was at war with, right? Yep. Which is an interesting, I suppose, starting place, isn't it, for a family? In what ways do those politics, have they manifested for you in your life, or those origins and the conflict that you came out of? Is it something you think about or notice, or is it just all in the past?
I've noticed it in particular ways. My family was very much like, they're from South Vietnam. They love the U.S. The U.S. protected them and saved their lives. And then welcomed them. So my family are the kind of immigrant who passionately loves the U.S. and think of themselves as like trying to maintain their original community, but be people. And I think actually be good U.S. citizens. And I mean, in some sense, I think the way this shows up in me is not as a child of conflict, but as a child of immigrants who really want to succeed in these societies. I mean, basically it shows up as me I wasn't raised, my parents didn't talk about the war very much. What they talked about is you need to get straight A's and go to a good college because we need to survive. And I think maybe in the background, you might think that part of that struggle and that aim comes from a sense of insecurity that I didn't experience directly, but was from them. And I think, again, part of my book is about this, right? It's about having a particular notion of success infringed on you. And I think I kind of broke away from it. A lot of my life is being like, ugh, I don't like this notion of success. And maybe one way to put it is, I think one of the most interesting things I found when I was researching this book is, so Thomas Hobbes, a lot of people know, political philosopher who thinks that morality comes from political power. And I found out while I was researching this book that what he actually thinks is that, well, he thinks that, but he also thinks that the core of political power is not might or armed forces, but the power over language. The power to tell people what success and failure mean, because that controls them from the inside. And I think a lot of my history with this book and being in philosophy is having my parents be very interested in a very rigid sense of what success meant. And being like, and I suspect that comes from their relationship to war, but I didn't experience that directly.
Or I guess, I mean, like you say, the immigrant experience, well, this is how this society quantifies success. So That's what we're going to aim for.
Yeah.
And you're right. That's exactly what you're taking aim at with this book. And I was thinking as well that so many of the big, powerful structures in US in tech, in particular, are metric-based, bureaucracies and powers and all of that. You're criticizing them. Yeah, I mean, this is, in many ways a sort of political statement against that way of imagining the world, right?
Yep.
Which again is a ballsy thing, I think, for someone coming from where your families come from to do, right? Because that's often not the way that people do that, is to kick against that.
Although I also think that there's a sense in which if you're presented in your childhood with an incredibly clear normative structure or rule structure about what you're supposed to think, either you accept it or you fight really hard against it. And if you fight really hard against it, you typically come, I find a lot of my students in philosophy have people come to philosophy. Often people come from philosophy from very rigid normative backgrounds, and then they lived one way of life very intensely, and then they threw it off. And if you have to fight hard to throw it off, then I think it's easier to occupy the space of being like, well, what are these systems trying to tell me, right? You've learned irony, you've learned doubt, you've learned how to be an outsider, and so I think it's a pathway that I recognize, especially in philosophy. Like a lot of people in philosophy have a similar story. They were like, I don't like this rule set I've been raised in.
Very interesting. Okay, let's come to your fifth and your final game from 2021. Tell us about this one.
This is Rounds. This is a party fighter. It's from Landfall Games, who also made Stick Fight the game. And in some sense, this is this pick is acknowledging where I am in my gaming life. When I was a kid, I was a teenager, I played 100-hour games, no problem. Now I'm a professional and a parent. And most of my gaming is actually with my kids. And Rounds is here because I play it with my kids. It's an incredible game. And it's a beautiful game because it's a game that I can enjoy playing all out with my 6-year-old. And I think that's magic. Like, I think one of the interesting things about if you have a certain aesthetic response to a territory, you might be more flexible. I think some people think like the aesthetes are the people that are the most, but I think there's a kind of aesthetic relationship to food where you're like, I'll love it all. Like, I'll love the fancy food. I love the sushi. I love the taco trucks. I love a good way of making a quick, fast, just, cheap and dirty burrito. Like, I can find a way to love all of it. And I think it's really useful for me to be flexible about games. Because right now I'm playing a lot of games with a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. And being able to find the awesomeness of those games is very satisfying. And Rounds I love because one of the things I've been really thinking about is accessible game design. And accessible here, I mean in a kind of deep way. I think a lot of people think about it. It's very important that we're accessible. The game design is accessible in kind of the ways that people recognize to various different ways of approaching the world. But I also think, I think one of the things I noticed about German game design that was really interesting was a lot of American hobbyist games I played as a kid, the war games, were very fragile to attitude and skill level. Everyone had to be hardcore, right? And equally willing to do ultra intense calculation. And a lot of the German board games were really interesting because they were designed to be really interesting, but also you could have some serious players, you could have some kids, you could have some, like people that were like more or less checked in, and the game didn't get ruined if someone was checked out. Like actually someone checked out or acting chaotically often added to the interest. There was this really clever design that made it all interesting. One of my favorite designs, this is also from Wolfgang Kramer. I thought it was an incredible design for adults versus kids. The game is called Gulo Gulo. It's like Candyland. It's a board game where you move your characters up a path of various colors, but the way you move them is there's this bowl with all these precariously balanced eggs and a stick sticking out of it, and to move to a certain color, you have to pluck that color from the bowl. So the game actually balances my ability to do better strategy about the colors, which is pretty simple, versus the fact that my kid has much smaller fingers. And that's so cool, right? We're actually even because his tiny fingers even it out. I love games that have this capacity to even things out in this way. Rounds, I think, it's really generous design. So the first game from Landfall Games, Stick Fight the game, party gamer, a lot of people know about Party Fighter, super fun, super chaotic, like designed to have super simple controls. My kids loved it. My problem with it was they wanted to play it every night for a year, and I got bored after about 50 nights of this, and I was just like, God, no, but they look, okay. Rounds is from the same people, and it keeps things interesting. So if you have you played Rounds?
I haven't, no. I'm going to after this then.
Okay, great. 2-player, quick, very easy to pick up party fighter. You start as these little circles that move. It's like a platform fighter. You move pretty slowly. You have this dinky gun that shoots a projectile that kind of has a slow arc, and you have 2 shots and you reload really slowly. And the way round works is, well, the name is funny because you are round, you're a circle. Your gun has round, and the game works. The crucial part is in rounds. Every time you lose the game, the game gives you a Hades-like draw of a random special power, and the special powers mount on top of each other. So you might get a draw, and you might choose heat-seeking bullets, or shotgun bullets, or bullets that bounce, or a shield that slows down the enemy. And then they stack in unpredictable ways. If you have heat-seeking shotgun bullets that also can, like, track over the ground, or right, like, so unlike the stick fight game, it's endlessly interesting because you're constantly mounting, like, a lot of the times by the end you're in a fight that you've never experienced before, right? Like, you have ultra fast bullets that grow larger and bounce 5 times, and the other side has, like, shields that shoot shotguns in every direction, and then you have to figure it out, right? So it's new. And 2, there's a catch-up mechanic, right? Every time you lose, you get a special power. And so when I play against my 6-year-old, he loses the first 2 or 3 rounds, and suddenly it's me with my dinky gun, and he's got, like, auto-fire poison bullets. And then it's a real contest. And I just find this, like, such generous, thoughtful design, right? This is a design that's really
so
attentive.
elegant.
Yeah, right? It's really attentive to the differences between players. It's really attentive to, like, keeping things open and creative. And it's got this incredibly natural, I mean, it's just neat emotional design too. Because when my kid has a hard time losing when he's younger, he likes losing in rounds because he gets a new power, and that's cool.
Right, yeah.
Emotionally wonderful. It's like anti-toxic.
Right. So cool. Right, T, we better go through your consoles. So we've got Dream Quest, Hyperlight Drifter, Apocalypse World (brackets on Zoom), Root, and Rounds. Amazing console. We need a name to market it to the world. Have you got an idea for what we could call your console and put on the box?
I didn't know I needed to come up with a name. God, what's the name?
Do you know what though? The name of your book would be a pretty good name for a console, I think. The Score.
The Score. Yeah, we can call it the Score, the gaming console. And it is, I think it is,
Yes.
like, a lot of what's interesting about, not all the games, but many of the games, is the scoring system. Root has this hyper-variable scoring system. Like Apocalypse World is about these experience points that reward dangerous motivational action. There's at least a bunch of examples of that in the console.
Well, there we go. It all ties together beautifully. And listeners can pick up your book, The Score, wherever they get their books. This has been absolutely glorious. Thank you so much for your time and for being so generous and for putting us on to so many great games. I'm sure loads of listeners are going to go out and try these if they don't know them already.
Thank you so much. It has been a delight.
Thank you so much to my guest, Thi Nguyen. So grateful to Thi for coming on the show, for discussing games in just such a thrilling way. I hope you got as much from that conversation as I did. His book, The Score, is out now wherever you get your books. It's really excellent. As I said in that conversation, the prose is just crisp, extremely elegantly written, but yeah, and he just leads readers through so skillfully the world of metrics, how they impact our world for good, for bad, for indifferent perhaps. Yeah, and anyone looking for an easy conclusion, it's not going to find that in this book. It's not, how gamification is going to save our world or how it's going to destroy our world or, anything like that. It's a much more nuanced, interested take on this whole world. I thought I'd read a little bit from the New York Times review of the book, which I think captures that sense really well. This was published back in late January 2026, so a couple of months ago. It was written by Jennifer Salai, and she writes in the conclusion to her review, "The philosophy of games turns out to be a nicely shaped container for exploring thorny questions about trust, knowledge, and authority." Nguyen wrote 2 endings for The Score and included both. Ending A is the cynical, sad one, in inverted commas. Ending B is, in inverted commas, the one with a little measure of hope. In ending A, we are trapped by the metrics. In ending B, games help us understand how players connected to freedom. He tries to offer the same inconclusiveness to his philosophy students. "If you come out of this with exactly my views, I have failed," he said. "That is not what I want to do with a classroom or a reader." But getting people to recognise what game they're playing can be a challenge when phony knowingness is more lavishly rewarded than genuine doubt. "I literally have students screaming, 'Tell me the expletive answer, T,'" he said. "I'm like, if you come out of this more confused about what's going on in the world and how to figure it out, then I have won. That is my goal." I hope that inspires you to pick up a copy of the book. It's really well worth your time. If you've got any interest in games, in scores, in gamification, in all of the things that affect so much of our lives now, how things are quantified, then it is the best deep dive on that I think you can possibly hope to read. And wasn't it great to hear all of Thi's choices as well? I know, as he put it in there, he cheated. I mean, I normally say to my guests that, I have a pretty wide definition for what constitutes a video game. Of course, my very first guest, Josh Wardle, creator of Wordle, picked the New York Times crossword, which I allowed because it involves a screen, one version of it. I suppose technically Thi's, was it his second or his third choice, involved a screen. It's just that screen was not technically part of the game. He was playing a board game with his friends via Zoom. I allowed it. What are you going to do? It'll be interesting how we update the website with that game. But anyway, I hope you forgive me and you forgive him, because he just had such a great way of articulating all of the things that he loved about those games, about the possibility space of play. I loved how, we could just unapologetically talk about those things without needing to discuss why they might be important or meaningful to people. It's just taken as read. If you're listening to this, then I hope you agree. I thought it was interesting as well, where he was talking about the changing perspective at institutions towards games and video games. I do think it is changing, as he said, and he said generationally. I think Thi is 48 or 49 years old, and he said he's right on the cusp of that generational shift, whereby people his age and younger accept games as a meaningful, space in which to explore ideas or history or systems or whatever it might be, and the generation before that perhaps looked down on them. Yeah, I mean, I do think things are changing. There seems to be increasing interest in academic circles, in games, in the nature of play. Certainly, I'm not an academic. I don't write academic books, but some of my friends are. Thank you. People like Holly Nielsen, who wrote her PhD on board games. I think Victorian board games. Might get that wrong. Don't kill me, Holly. Another good friend of mine, Maurice Casey, who is super interested in games and has written about them. He has got a piece coming out, in fact, in the forthcoming edition of A Profound Waste of Time, where he's investigated a factory in Tipperary that manufactured arcade machines for Atari and the impact that had on the community there. So anyway, there are people involved in academia who are writing about games and interested in them. Ian Bogost, of course, as well. But anyway, we'll get some more on the show, I think. We'll sprinkle them, the academic perspectives in amongst all the other kinds of guests that I have on, but so worthwhile. And I think that conversation in this episode proves that, we can go to some places with academics that perhaps you can't go with other people because they've thought so deeply about these very specific things. Okay, well, if you would like to know more about the podcast and what's happening and where we're going, then the best way to do that is to head to patreon.com/myperfectconsole. Thank you to all of you who support the show. There are many of you who are supporters on there. There is a free tier, so you can just, if you're on Patreon, then you can get updates through that. But the best way, of course, if you're willing, is to pay about the cost of a cup of coffee or whatever it be a month. It helps get the show made. For that, you also get your episodes early and ad-free. You get one bonus episode every month as well with myself and comedian Glenn Moore. We play through a video game that was picked by a previous guest on the show, a bit like a book club. We all play it through, the listeners and myself and Glenn. This month we're playing through Amplitude, which was picked by Keza MacDonald, the Guardian games editor, whose recent book on Nintendo has been going down super, super well. Keza picks Amplitude as one of her games, and we're playing through the re-release of that came out a few years ago. You can get it on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, probably on PC as well. It's not very expensive. It's a fantastic game, one of the precursors to Guitar Hero. And a bit like Thumper as well, if you played that game, Thumper and Thrasher. Of course, I had the creator of those games on last year. But anyway, yes, if you become a Patreon supporter, you get access to those bonus episodes where we discuss our thoughts on the game. And there's a huge back catalogue going back 3 years now of monthly episodes for myself and Glenn. They're really, really fun. Sign up and you can listen to all of them. You can follow us on social media as well, on Blue Sky, on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You'll find us in all the usual places. You'll get little clips, advanced clips showing off who the guest is next week. It's the only way to do that. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Big Games Machine for their help in running the socials. It's very much appreciated. PR agency, you can check out their work at their website. You can also write to me at myperfectconsole@gmail.com. Please do. It's lovely to hear from you. I know the podcast is now, it's been going for 3 and a bit years now, but it's always lovely to hear from listeners, especially if you've come to the show more recently and you're diving back into the back catalogue or whatever it might be. Then, do write to me. Let me know your thoughts, your suggestions, any guests you'd like to see coming up this year. Had loads of great suggestions. And I'm inviting them on. In fact, this week's guest, Thi Nguyen, was suggested by one of the Patreon listeners. So, it does work and I can get people on quite quickly if I get the right hookups. So, please do write to me. That's myperfectconsole@gmail.com and let me know your thoughts, suggestions, and suggestions for future guests as well. Okay, next week, my guest is Simon Lockerbie. Now, Simon is someone whose work I was not familiar with, but his team wrote and asked if he could come on the show. He's got a really interesting backstory, so I was only too pleased to invite him on. Simon's made a game, but his background is not in game design or making at all. He was a sales director, I think, for the kind of company that logistics firm that gets food to the supermarkets on time so that their shelves can remain stocked. He began playing a mobile game called Raid Shadow Legends on his daily commute to work, and eventually decided to launch a YouTube channel built around the game. And within a year, he had more than 100,000 subscribers, and decided to then, with his collaborator, form a game studio and make his own game. And that's what he's done. So yeah, very excited to speak to Simon. He's got some great game choices, and his story is super interesting. Again, shows a different sort of slice of the video game industry that we don't necessarily often hear about. And so yeah, I'm excited to share his story with you. So please do join me again next week when I'll be back with Simon with his 5 games, and with one more perfect console.